Welcome everyone to Current in 30, the 30-minute webinar series brought to you by the Current Consulting Group. We are thrilled to have you with us. To briefly introduce this series, each session is designed to keep you informed, efficient, and ahead of the curve. On the second and fourth Mondays of each month throughout 2026, we'll break down key things you need to know about workplace drug screening, from emerging trends and regulatory updates to best practices and practical implementation tips. If you missed our previous sessions, please visit our website, currentconsultinggroup.com, or our YouTube channel at Current Consulting Group to view those sessions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled Oral Fluid Drug Testing, How It Can Strengthen Your Drug-Free Workplace Program. This presentation qualifies for half of a professional development credit from Sherman HRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. Today's presentation welcomes Senior Vice President of the Current Consulting Group, Brian Feely. Brian has more than 40 years of experience in the medical diagnostics industry. He is named as an inventor on 4 patents in the diagnostics field, is an author of numerous publications, and speaks frequently at industry meetings and workshops. He is considered an expert in the science, sales, and marketing of drug and alcohol testing products, with a particular focus on the merits of oral fluid drug testing. Brian is also well-versed in compliance services, such as drug testing policy, training for supervisors and employees, and state and federal law issues. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Brian Feely from the Current Consulting Group.
Thank you, Greta. Appreciate that very much. Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending our 30-minute webinars. These are designed to be kind of snappy, and so I'll go through some details about oral fluid testing rather quickly. We'll leave a little time for questions at the end, hopefully, and again, thanks for joining us. The oral fluid topic is some of you, if you know me, is near and dear to my heart. I've spent quite a few years in the overall development of oral fluid tests and the sales and marketing of these tests as well. And so oral fluid testing isn't new. It's been around, in fact, and been used in a couple of different marketplaces, including workplace, for about 30 years now. But we're finally getting to a point, I think, where the regulated testing, and that would be for federal and for DOT testing, is about to kick in. There's some things that are being addressed right now that have been a barrier to the implementation of oral fluid testing, but hopefully we're going to see those barriers lifted very soon relative to FDA, and hopefully have some implementation going when a few of the labs get certified. Hopefully this year. So I'm going to go through a couple of things quickly here about oral fluid and overall what is oral fluid testing, just to clarify in case the audience doesn't really know. But saliva or oral fluid, those terms are used interchangeably for the most part, even though they are a little different. It's really one and the same when it comes to the tests that are developed for drugs of abuse and for alcohol. The unique part about oral fluid that's different than other types of specimens, particularly urine, is that these are the drugs and the materials that we test for in oral fluid are present right away in the oral fluid sample, literally within minutes of a substance being used. So that's really key when it comes to detecting recent use, which we'll talk about here in a second. But also it tends to pick up the parent drug, which is now providing some interesting benefits when it comes to some of the state laws and marijuana and how that's being looked at and being challenged. So that's a plus. And the other part that we'll touch on is, the oral fluid is just so easy to collect. It's a device that goes in the mouth. It's a quick delivery type process where it goes into a vial or into a rapid test, and really easy to do and can be done pretty much anytime, anywhere. So what I'm going to do is touch on some of the things that I see that we've seen over the years that are, let's call it the top 5, if you will. And then later in the presentation, I'll touch on some other things that may be a little bit lesser known. So oral fluid is really easy to collect. and it gives a convenience factor that I'm going to speak about a little bit. It really is great at revealing recent use, which is becoming really important when it comes to things like looking at potential impairment, looking at did somebody use them when they came into work this morning. And that's not necessarily the case with, certainly not with hair testing, and even urine testing has a longer detection window, if you will, where you're not picking it up right away. It's really hard to beat or subvert an oral fluid sample. And logistically, there's some benefits over other methods that are really important. And there's an element of surprise to the testing process that I think is pretty unique. So I'm going to go through each one of these rather quickly and touch on each one in a little more detail. So the ease and the convenience of the collection process, being able to do that at almost anywhere, anytime is a unique aspect of an oral fluid sample. You're not needing a bathroom, or you don't need to go to a collection site. You really reduce those long wait times that could sometimes occur when an employee or even an applicant has to go to a collection site. And it also eliminates those gender issues that sometimes take place with an existing employee. If there is a situation where an observed collection has to take place, you don't need to worry about the gender of the collector. They have a male for a male collection donor, or do they have a female, et cetera. So that goes away. All of this speed and the convenience leads to greater compliance overall within a program, because people don't get frustrated with the process and end up, giving up on a collection or sort of thinking about stopping their drug testing program, which leads to improved safety. That's really a key message here, I think, of all these slides that I think you're going to see. Oral fluid testing detects recent use, and it does so better than urine and hair. That's not a surprise or anything new. If you follow the state of drug testing, over recent years. So we're really picking up the drugs in oral fluid within about 10 minutes of someone's use of it, and then it continues through the workday, and that's really becoming very important, particularly as it relates to marijuana. That ability to detect recent use is critical in things like post-accident and for-cause testing. So if you're looking for some of the most, relevant applications for oral fluid, while it's applied very broadly across all forms of testing, including pre-employment, because of that recent use, it's really good for those post-incident, for-cause, suspicion type situations that could potentially even link to impairment. And so it also says something about an individual's ability to abstain. If you're testing an applicant for a job and they come up positive on an oral fluid test, that doesn't say a lot about their ability to abstain, and that's just not the kind of individual you'd like to have in your workplace. So this recent use detection capability is allowing people to, we're allowing us to look at what's in their system now, linking it to incidents, and also supporting just say for hiring decisions for the type of people that you're looking at. And all of these slides, I think there's a little note at the bottom, over the last 25 or even 30 years, these are the kinds of things that have allowed oral fluid to step into the highlight and become one of the things that people, almost all providers, offer now, and many end users are adopting in their workplace. Number 3, so oral fluid is very difficult to subvert, or adulterate. That means, even dilution, intentional or unintentional, it's really hard to see anybody doing that in the workplace or any setting, because every collection is really being observed, 100% observed. So oral fluid samples are not typically subject to that dilution thing. Sometimes you have workers that are in the field, especially in the summer, they're in construction, or they're on projects where they're sweating, and there's a tendency for people to just hydrate a lot, and someone that would get called into a drug test situation like that, with urine screening, depending on the level of dilution, that could come up as a dilute specimen. You can't do that with oral fluid. It doesn't work that way. It's actually a filtrate of your blood. So being able to catch the potential cheaters really is a way to further improve safety in the workplace, because by weeding them out, so to speak, you're really getting, you're identifying people who might otherwise have found a way to beat their drug test, and that leads to improved safety. Logistical benefits. We saw this a lot when people first started to talk about oral fluid testing and where it was ideal, particularly things like remote locations where there isn't a collection site nearby, or it's a third shift or it's a weekend. An oral fluid collection can be done right there on site by a supervisor or someone in safety or risk or even in HR. Very easy to observe the collection and get the sample sent out to a lab, or even do the test, the rapid test right there on site. So this allows, improves on the amount of time that it takes to get the drug test done, get people back to work. And there's also the capability now for, you may have seen some of these tests coming out where you can do testing in home that hit pretty hard during COVID, and a lot of things were coming out into the market where you can do this test at home. You can do the same thing with an oral fluid collection. It can be videoed and it can be watched by a professional, and samples sent into a laboratory or even done right there on the spot. So that's kind of new and exciting aspect of oral fluid as well. You can't do that with any other specimen type. And so number 5, this is an interesting one. People sometimes don't think of this element of surprise. And we saw this when we first started to launch oral fluid back in the early 2000s. There were some retailers, one large one in particular, who found that just by putting a sign in the window that we do, oral fluid for pre-employment drug screening, they found that self-eliminated folks that were coming up, and they'd see that in the window. They'd say, I don't know how to beat that one. I might know how to beat my urine test, but this one I just don't know how to beat. So they go on to the next potential hiring organization. And so that helps to weed out some people that might otherwise cheat on their test. So the element of surprise is kind of a cool aspect, because again, while it's becoming more and more popular, people tend to expect the urine screen when they're going for their test. So with that, I want to kind of go into something that ties into recent use that I touched on. And it's a key aspect of drug tests in general. When you're selecting a test, you really want to know more about and consider the window of detection of the test. What am I really detecting? And it's important to realize that one size doesn't need to fit all. For so many years, it was all about urine screening, and people just didn't know, much about oral fluid or other testing methods. But really, when you look at it, this is like a toolbox today. There's lots of different tests that have come out, and they can be used for different applications. While oral fluid tends to be easier across the board, it doesn't have to be all oral fluid or all urine or all hair testing. So there's 3 different buckets here, if you will: short window, an intermediate window, and a long window. What does that really mean? So the short window, you're looking at hours to maybe a day. Really good, use of some of the impairment tests, quote unquote, right, that are coming onto the market, and whether they really detect what type of impairment or what they're really assessing. Bottom line is they're assessing what's going on right now within that person. And oral fluid is a recent use test in that short window as well. And then there's breath THC that's hit the market and is continuing to evolve and improve. It's relatively new, but you can use breath for THC today. So that's an interesting thing. All of these being recent use tests that measure typically the parent drug, which is more associated with what's going on right now when that person showed up to work. And there are some statistics that we go over in some other webinars that I won't get too far into, but essentially there's more and more data coming out for people who are marijuana cannabis users who self-admit to the fact that they use their marijuana before they go to work. In some cases, there's even people like a fairly significant percentage, over 40% of the people who commented in a survey that they actually use at work, on a break or at lunch. And so you really, when you're dealing with something like this today with marijuana, you really do want a recent drug use test, especially in a state where it's legal. And I'll come back to that in a second. Intermediate windows are where you're seeing things like urine screening being the most applicable. What did they do a week ago? You can pick up. Oral fluid is actually good for certain drugs out to a few days. It's more narrow for marijuana, in that workday type of window. But oral fluid can be used for looking at substances as well. That it'll last a couple days for other drugs. So you're looking at recent to past use, not necessarily picking up the parent drug unless it's oral fluid. Marijuana is the metabolite of marijuana is what you pick up in urine, and that's not necessarily good in certain states, in certain cases, which I think I will also touch on briefly. Your long window is really weeks to months, and that typically is hair testing, right? So you're looking at past use, you're looking at lifestyle, and what have they done? You know, what did they do months ago in the case of hair testing? So those are, I think, you know, things to keep in mind when you're selecting a drug testing method and you're thinking about what might I want to add to my program. Those windows of detection are important to keep in mind. So how might oral fluid align with state laws and some of the things that are evolving out there? Well, so if you're involved with your policy and your, you know, writing of your drug-free workplace program, you know there's a lot of different issues to keep in mind with regard to laws, in particular the state laws. There are mandatory ones that you must follow. There are voluntary ones that you can follow and get certain benefits from. And so, you know, that's a thing that we deal with when we help people with policy writing. That's something that Current Consulting Group can assist with and has for many, many years. There are things like case laws that you have to keep in mind. In certain states, there has been case law that is really important, and in fact could become one of your decision-making factors when you look at what you might adopt in terms of methodology, what you need to avoid, how you need to be careful about certain things, because case law becomes pretty much an accepted thing that a court would look at and then an attorney would bring up. Which can basically, you know, swing a challenge one way or the other. Of course, there's workers' comp and unemployment compensation laws, different in many states. Something you really have to be aware of. Industry-specific laws, a little more pertinent to specific areas like public works and mining. And now, of course, one of the biggest challenges is the whole medical and recreational marijuana situation. 40 states and a territory in DC have medical marijuana laws. 24 states in DC have recreational marijuana laws. So when you're dealing with a policy, you have to be careful about what those state laws say if you do business in those states, and that you have an addenda in your policy. And in some cases, you want to make sure that you're using the right methodology. And in some cases, it's oral fluid that you want to be adding or making sure that you're covering. For example, and just one quick slide on the things that may be favoring oral fluid testing, because of that parent drug that I covered, it's increasingly being used in certain state laws. For example, California and Washington, which I think I'll touch on here in a second. More laws are also adding restrictions to what you can and cannot do with a drug testing scenario, unless you have indications of impairment, and they're starting to use that language in certain states. So oral fluid doesn't necessarily prove impairment, but because it's such a great indicator of very recent use, if you start to combine your observations, your signs and symptoms, along with the testing, and it comes up positive using oral fluid, and everything has been well documented, you're much more likely to be able to you know, stand on solid ground than if you did a urine test, for example, which is looking at past use. And then oral fluid has been approved by HHS some years ago, and now the DOT has it included in their rules for testing for, you know, all the different modals, motor carriers and aviation, et cetera. We're still waiting for 2 labs to be approved and certified, which we're actually thinking should happen sooner now rather than later. So there were some barriers and some things going on with FDA approval requirements, and it's likely they're going to be lifted, and we'll see a couple of labs being certified here, maybe even in 2026. So that will open it up to not just non-regulated testing, but also the regulated areas of drug testing. So back to the comments about California and Washington. California law, I think it was January of 2024, now states that applicants and employees in the state of California are subject to this provision of not testing for the metabolite, which is the non-psychoactive form of the drug. And Washington, the state of Washington law applies to pre-employment testing. So a California employer cannot take adverse employment action based on the result of a non-psychoactive cannabis metabolite test. That's urine screening. So if you're in California or in Washington related to pre-employment testing, you really are not compliant with these laws if you're still using urine screening and taking action based on a urine test, because it's looking at past use. As I covered before, that's metabolite, that's past use. It could have been yesterday, it could have been a week ago with urine testing. With oral fluid, you're really looking at the psychoactive form of the drug, which is the parent, and so you're more in line with what the law says in both of those states. And likely, this is the kind of laws that we're going to see continuing to be added, and language we're going to see continue to be added over time. There are some exceptions in California, some carve-outs in the construction area and building trades, and Washington has a couple of positions that are carved out as well. But essentially, these are the kinds of things that are starting to lend themselves even more so to oral fluid testing. In a survey that we do 2 surveys every year, one for providers, which would be TPAs and collectors, et cetera. This question has come up in our 2025 survey. We asked this question, and it continues to be covered in the field. We asked providers whether they're seeing California and Washington clients switching to oral fluid testing, and you can see this is very clear. Almost 2/3, over 2/3 of them are moving to an oral fluid test, or seeing customers move to oral fluid tests. So this continues to implement itself. We do still talk to clients though in California and Washington who either didn't catch it or they're still, they haven't changed their policy yet or their program, and that's not great because they're really not being compliant with the laws out there. So a couple lesser known facts about oral fluid testing. When we first started to implement oral fluid back in the early 2000s, we got introduced to a couple of large manufacturers. One of them that had, literally 100 different union contracts that they negotiated from one time to another. And unions in general don't like drug testing, and it's just something that is an impediment to employing their membership. But they also get it that it's an important safety sensitive issue, and that you certainly don't want to be dealing with incidents that occur because of not drug testing. But as oral fluid got implemented in some of those companies and the union contracts became up for renewal, the companies would slowly integrate the oral fluid concept into this. And we're finding that generally there was less resistance because of the fact that it's non-invasive, it's easy to collect, it is that shorter window, so you're not denying people employment for what they might have done on their vacation or 3 weeks ago on a weekend. And that's becoming more and more important with marijuana today. So generally speaking, a little more union friendly. I mentioned earlier that the gender issue concern between the collector and the donor, and that's not necessarily always overly evident for someone who's sitting perhaps in an office and they're waiting for a drug result to come back. But there are these things that take place at the collection sites where if someone isn't able to provide a specimen or there's suspicion that arises and a observed collection needs to take place, then they need to make sure they have the right collector gender to do that, to observe that collection. And so that goes away with oral fluid. And I think the other thing that's sometimes not evident is oral fluid can save money for an employer, depending upon how they go about and what they're adopting with their oral fluid test. And just as a quick example, if we have a presentation we do on ROI and how that works and how people should be looking at their program. And oftentimes we find they don't necessarily consider all the aspects of their drug testing fees, the collection fee, the time away from work, like you have your direct fees, which your collection costs, the cost of the test, MRO, all those things. And then you have your indirect costs, which is if you're doing urine screening and you're sending people off to a collection site, and sometimes even sending a supervisor, that's time away from work. So there's wages, there's benefits, there's the things that you're losing. There's even, loss in productivity while those people are away to give their drug test. And we all know that people don't necessarily rush back to work when a random test comes up and they have to go to a collection site. And if they get there and they can't provide a urine sample, it can take up to several hours sometimes for them to provide that sample. So when you add up all that, and you should look at that in your drug testing program, the costs that are involved with an oral fluid test, which is literally collected in minutes, and that person is back in the workplace, because you can't fake or can't say you can't provide an oral fluid sample. In very rare cases would that occur, you'd have to have very dry mouth, and there's ways to deal with that, again, very quickly compared to providing a urine sample. So all in all, you can end up saving money moving to an oral fluid test. So, we're here to help. We have a lot of the services that I've spoken about with regard to the state laws and policy development. We have a state law database, which is the most up-to-date one out there. It's literally updated every week, I think, and provides all the different state laws relative to drug and alcohol testing, marijuana, all the different things that people need to get access to, particularly if you're doing your own policy, or if you're a provider helping guide someone with regard to their drug testing program. That state law database is priceless. And we do the policy development work too. So for years we've reviewed policies, we've written them from scratch or updated people's policies, and really every policy should be looked at on an annual basis to see if there's some things that have changed that should be updated in that policy. You've started to do business in another state, so the marijuana laws have changed in a state where you do business, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that need to be considered frequently. We also have online training courses. So if you're looking for DOT or non-DOT training, reasonable suspicion, signs and symptoms training, the different modals of the DOT, we have all that training. We can do that online or also in person. We have trainers that can go out to sites and sometimes do that as requested. We also really understand all the drug and alcohol, testing products and providers out there, so we can help with regard to some consulting in that area if you're new to it, or you're just looking to touch base on this whole thing with oral fluid. What products are out there, who does it, what labs, what providers are there. We can help with that. And then of course on the regulatory side, we provide reports and memos and write white papers and provide legislative updates on a regular basis for our clients that do business with us. So I think that kind of summarizes our current and 30 oral fluid webinar, and I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Brian, I think we have time for one question. With more states limiting marijuana testing, do you see oral fluid becoming the go-to method moving forward?
Well, I certainly think it's going to become much more adopted than it is today. And when the SAMHSA guidelines hit some years ago, they projected a certain percentage of movement to oral fluid. It was well over 30% of the market would move to oral fluid over a 4-year period. And I actually think that that's going to be more significant than that. I wouldn't be surprised to see over 50% of the market be oral fluid testing as the marijuana laws continue to allow for more usage. And now, of course, we have a new change going on where there could be a change in the schedule of marijuana from 1 to 3, which will make it even more accessible, I think, and more states will probably use that as a way to justify the legalization of marijuana, thinking that it's less harmful, less addictive, which of course it is not. But that's part of the political environment. Not to get into that, but the bottom line is we will see more marijuana legalization, more medical use, which I think is going to have more people looking at oral fluid as a solution.
Great. Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you to everyone joining us for today's edition of Current in 30. We do hope that these insights help you stay informed and confident in your workplace drug screening decisions. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded and you will receive instructions in a few days informing you how to access the recording. And if you submitted a question that we didn't get to, no worries, we will answer you offline. Additionally, this presentation qualified for half of a professional development credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attended today's presentation in its entirety. If you have met that requirement, you will be emailed the activity IDs. Remember, we'll be back every second and fourth Mondays of 2026 with things you need to know to stay current in this industry. Be sure to follow the Current Consulting Group and check your inbox for upcoming session details. Until next time, stay current and have a great day.